There is a kind of knowledge that is not illegal, but people still avoid it. Not because it is wrong, but because it is dangerous for those who benefit from you not knowing it. This video is not about hating women, it is not about cheap manipulation, it is about seeing the game that has always existed. But most people don't want to admit it. Once you understand this, you stop living in fear, and that is why they hope you never learn it. People will never say this openly, but there is a quiet fear inside private conversations and late-night thoughts. This fear does not come from physical power. It comes from awareness. When a man starts to see beyond fake politeness, beyond romantic stories, beyond the masks people wear, many women secretly hope you never learn this truth. Because once you do, the game changes, and power becomes visible. Machiavelli did not talk about love. He talked about control, perception, and strategy. And what worked in war also works in relationships, even when people pretend there is no competition. From a young age, you are told that relationships are always honest, feelings are always pure, and intentions are always clear. But this is the first lie used to keep everything under control. Machiavelli said that most people need simple stories, so they don't question complicated systems. In attraction, the person who believes too much usually loses. The one who watches and understands wins, not because they manipulate, but because they understand how decisions are really made. Emotions do not follow moral logic. They follow stimulus, reward, and absence. Desire doesn't come from what's always available. It comes from what might be lost. No one tells you this, but predictability destroys attraction. Not because women like games, but because the human brain gets bored when it feels completely safe and in control. Too much comfort kills interest, just like desperation does. Machiavelli said that a prince who becomes predictable becomes weak. The same happens to a man who gives everything too easily, explains himself too much, and offers commitment before anything is earned. He thinks he is doing the right thing, but actually, he is losing his strategic value. There is a big difference between being good and being convenient. A convenient man is only valued while he never asks for anything. A man who knows his worth does not beg for acceptance or chase validation, and he does not reveal everything about himself too soon. Mystery doesn't mean no feelings, it simply means not exposing everything too early. If you show your whole self to everyone, you become ordinary, and what is ordinary is rarely deeply desired. The uncomfortable truth is that many reactions are not conscious. They happen before logic or morality. Attraction doesn't ask, is this fair? It asks, is this interesting? Machiavelli said people judge more by what they see than what they truly understand, because seeing is easier. In relationships, how you present yourself matters more than what you secretly feel. Those who learn to control presence, absence, silence, and timing can influence without asking for anything. This kind of knowledge is scary because it removes comfortable innocence. It shows that being overly available is not a virtue. It is a tactical mistake. Trying to convince someone of your value already means you don't understand the game. Real value is not negotiated, it is noticed. If you explain too much, justify too much, or prove too much, you already lost ground. This is not cruelty. It is human nature. Women don't fear strong men. They fear men who are emotionally aware, men who don't panic over rejection, men who don't try to buy affection with desperate effort, men who don't make one person the center of their universe, because such a man cannot be controlled by fear of loss. He chooses, he doesn't beg. He watches, he doesn't react impulsively. He understands that the person who shows less need has more control in decisions. Machiavelli never taught people to hate. He taught people to see reality, and seeing reality can hurt, because it breaks illusions. The illusion that love is always mutual, that pure intentions always bring good results, that being the right person at the wrong time has no cost. It does, and the cost is often being forgotten. The world doesn't reward your intention. It rewards your correct understanding of situations. Those who learn this early suffer less later. This knowledge doesn't make you cold. It makes you complete, someone who doesn't rely on others' approval to feel worthy. And that is why such a person becomes dangerous. Not violent, not abusive, but uncontrollable. Because he doesn't bend from emotional need, he doesn't accept crumbs of attention, he doesn't accept roles that lower his value. He knows when to stay, he knows when to leave, and most importantly, he knows when silence says more than words. This kind of man rarely appears, but when he does, he exposes the weakness in many social stories. He shows that many rules only work on people who never question them. So yes, there is a silent wish that men never reach this level of awareness, because once you see it, you cannot unlearn it. The game still exists, but now you're not playing in the dark. When a man realizes that relationships aren't about what people say, but about how they behave, something inside him changes. It's not arrogance, it's clarity. He starts to see patterns he once ignored. Who pulls away when they are given too much priority? Who comes closer only when they feel they might lose you? Who tests limits while pretending it is about morality? Machiavelli said the biggest mistake is confusing words with intentions. Words exist to protect appearances. Actions reveal strategy. Few people admit this. Attraction doesn't grow where everything is guaranteed. The human mind reacts to contrast, controlled uncertainty, and challenge. When everything is available, nothing feels valuable. When everything is predictable, nothing is strongly desired. This is not female evil, it is human nature. The difference is that few men accept this truth without fighting it with moral speeches that only weaken them further. The man who understands this stops over-explaining. He knows that the one who feels forced to justify himself is already on the defensive. Machiavelli taught that a prince should never appear weak, even when he is simply being patient. And today, patience doesn't mean waiting for messages. It means not acting out of anxiety. It means keeping your posture even when your ego wants instant validation. It means not turning interest into desperation. There is a specific moment when many men lose control, when they feel they might lose someone. Then they start giving too much, agreeing too much, promising too much. They think extra effort shows value, but actually, it shows fear. And fear, even when hidden, is felt. The energy changes, and the person who senses it moves into the stronger position in the dynamic. Machiavelli said that real power is never spoken. It is shown through behavior. The person who panics shows dependence. The one who stays calm shows that they have options. A man who understands this doesn't threaten to leave. He is simply willing to leave, and that willingness changes everything, because it removes the other person's sense of total control. From that point on, the relationship is no longer one-sided. Another truth people avoid is role reversal. Many men become emotionally predictable while expecting the other person to stay spontaneous. This creates imbalance. The one who always calls, always fixes things, always keeps contact, becomes the emotional maintainer. And the maintainer is rarely desired with intensity. He becomes useful, not exciting. Machiavelli would say, being necessary is not the same as being respected. And respect is the invisible base of long-term attraction. When a man stops trying to be chosen and starts choosing, the dynamic changes. Not because he becomes arrogant, but because he no longer accepts anything less than respect. He watches actions, not words. He notices inconsistencies. He doesn't excuse disrespect in the name of hope. He doesn't confuse occasional attention with real interest. For someone used to controlling the pace, this is uncomfortable. Women don't fear rejection as much as they fear becoming irrelevant. And the man who understands this doesn't try to compete for validation. He knows that anyone who competes for approval has already lost authority. He doesn't over-explain to be accepted. He positions himself to be respected. And when he isn't respected, he quietly walks away. That silent distance speaks louder than any argument. Machiavelli warned that the biggest mistake is believing others play fair just because you do. The world doesn't work on moral agreements. It works on incentives. When you give everything for free, people lose interest. When you have standards, people become curious. When you give yourself completely without limits, you create one-sided dependence. When you protect yourself, you create healthy tension. And tension fuels attraction. That is why this kind of understanding doesn't spread easily, because it destroys the comfortable system where one person always leads and the other always chases. When a man realizes he doesn't need to convince, beg, or insist, he stops being predictable. And unpredictability, when it comes from inner stability, becomes powerful. Not violent, just powerful. This man doesn't play childish games, he doesn't fake disinterest, he simply doesn't act from emotional need. If there is reciprocity, he moves forward. If there is confusion, he steps back. No fights, no long speeches, no long explanations. Machiavelli would call this saving your energy, using only what is necessary, never more than the situation requires. And this is the moment when many people realize, too late, that they have lost control of the story. Because now they can no longer trigger easy emotional reactions. They can no longer predict the other person. They can no longer get guarantees without offering something real in return. When that happens, the power shifts. Things become truly serious when a man stops seeking emotional approval and starts acting from self-control. This is not coldness, it is inner stability. Machiavelli said that the one who governs himself can govern anything else better, and there is nothing more unstable than emotions where people make promises without thinking and break them without warning. A man who understands this does not base his stability on other people's reactions. He builds it on his own standards. What nobody teaches is that the biggest social power is not speech. It is the ability not to react immediately. Most people live like a reflex. A message arrives, they reply. A provocation happens, they attack back. Silence appears, anxiety grows. The person who escapes this pattern controls the pace without saying a single word. Silence, when it comes from someone who doesn't need to explain themselves, has more impact than any argument. Machiavelli knew that the deepest fear is not punishment, it is uncertainty. When a man stops reacting the way others expect, he forces the other person to make the next move, and the one who moves first reveals their true intentions. This breaks subtle power games built on confusion. Many relationships only continue because one side accepts confusion in exchange for hope. But when that hope disappears, only the truth remains: interest or convenience, presence or habit, desire or comfort. And not everyone is ready to face that difference. Modern culture repeats a lie again and again, that communication solves everything. Machiavelli would laugh at that. Communication only works when power is balanced. When it is not, communication only exposes weakness. Explaining your feelings to someone who shows no emotional responsibility does not create connection. It gives them advantage. Information is power only when you control when and how you share it. If you reveal too much, you become predictable, and predictability is a strategic weakness. A man who understands this doesn't shut down. He simply chooses carefully. He doesn't share everything with just anyone. He looks for consistency before investing deeply. He doesn't confuse strong early emotions with real commitment. He knows enthusiasm is easy, but consistency is rare, so he doesn't get impressed quickly. This quietly changes the dynamic. Because the person who is not easily impressed soon becomes the one who is being evaluated, not just the evaluator. Machiavelli said a leader should depend more on respect than affection. The same applies here. Affection changes, desire changes, but respect lasts. Respect is born from clear boundaries. A man who does not accept disrespect, who does not bargain with his dignity, who does not excuse bad behavior just because he feels lonely, becomes a strong presence. He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to threaten. His posture says everything. That is why many people criticize this mindset, calling it games, coldness, or manipulation. Because admitting that it works means admitting that many choices are not as conscious as people think. Machiavelli was hated, not because he was wrong, but because he said openly what people practice silently. He didn't create human nature, he only described it. When a man understands that he does not need to be chosen to feel worthy, he becomes selective, and selectiveness is rare. What is rare becomes valuable, not because it demands attention, but because it is not available to everyone. This man doesn't compete for attention. He watches to see who puts effort into staying. And this simple change shifts the whole emotional dynamic, because it forces the other person to leave the comfort zone of only receiving. What scares people most is not losing external control, but losing internal control when the other person does not react as expected. Messages don't come. Explanations are not given. Availability is no longer guaranteed. This triggers deep insecurity. Someone who understands this doesn't exploit it to be cruel, but he also doesn't rush to fix emotions he didn't create. He lets the other person handle their feelings like an adult. Machiavelli said, "A wise ruler lets others exhaust themselves." The same happens here. A man who doesn't play emotional games lets inconsistency reveal itself. He doesn't chase every confusing sign, he watches patterns, and patterns never lie. If someone wants to be there, they show it. If they don't, they create confusion. And the man who understands this doesn't insist where he isn't welcome. This kind of clarity is rare because it requires self-control. It means accepting that you may lose people who would only stay if you made yourself smaller. It means letting go of the fantasy that extra effort creates love. It doesn't. It creates unhealthy dependence. And dependence never sustains real desire. The man who accepts this truth loses his illusions, but gains inner sovereignty. And that is why many hope you never learn this way of seeing things, because once you do, you can no longer be controlled by guilt, urgency, or fear of being alone. You start choosing based on behavior, not promises. When someone loses the ability to control you, they also lose the comfort of knowing what you will do next. There is an invisible point where the dynamic stops being emotional and becomes structural. Very few people notice when they cross this line. It's the moment when a man stops reacting to emotions and starts acting from principles. Machiavelli understood that real stability doesn't come from passion. It comes from inner consistency. Someone who is calm inside cannot be controlled from the outside. And this is very uncomfortable for anyone who is used to leading through emotional chaos. Most modern relationships survive on small imbalances. One person waits more, one invests more, one fears losing more. That person usually ends up giving more than they should, not because they want to, but because they feel they must. A man who wakes up to this sees something harsh. The more someone fears losing, the easier they are to influence, not out of cruelty, but simply through behavior. The one who fears losing acts. The one who doesn't fear losing observes. Machiavelli warned that a ruler should never rule out of fear of losing his throne, because the moment he fears loss, he is already weaker. The same applies here. When a man fears losing someone, he starts negotiating his limits, accepting inconsistency, tolerating subtle disrespect, all to hold on to something that is already slipping away. But that reaction, even if done with good intentions, only makes the loss happen faster. When a man understands that loss is not a threat to his identity, but simply a natural filter, he becomes impossible to manipulate emotionally. He doesn't react to tests. He doesn't defend himself against provocations. He doesn't rush to prove his value when he feels distance. He observes, and silent observation reveals more than any long conversation ever could. What most people don't realize is this: emotional tests are not meant to measure love. They measure control. How far will you go? How much will you accept? How much will you tolerate? The man who passes every test fails the most important one: respect, because someone who accepts everything sets no boundaries. Machiavelli said that too much kindness leads to contempt, not gratitude, and contempt is the beginning of the end. There is a comfortable belief that emotional maturity always means explaining, talking, clarifying. But Machiavelli knew that explaining too much is a mistake when the other person does not show equal responsibility. Communication without reciprocity becomes exposure. Exposure without limits becomes vulnerability. A man who understands this doesn't shut down, but he also doesn't open his deepest emotions to someone who hasn't earned that level of access yet. He also realizes that not every distance needs to be fixed. Some distances are answers, some are messages disguised as silence. Trying to chase them doesn't create closeness, it creates exhaustion. A man who masters himself accepts what is shown, not what is promised. He doesn't attach to potential, he responds to reality. Machiavelli said, "Men offend out of fear or hate." In relationships, many confusing actions come from fear of losing control. When someone realizes that you don't react the way they expect, you don't beg, you don't justify yourself, you don't bend, this creates deep insecurity in them. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped being predictable. And when something is unpredictable, but calm, it can feel threatening. A man who reaches this level of awareness doesn't play games. He simply stops being played. He doesn't create fake scarcity. He is rare because he doesn't join every emotional dynamic. He doesn't promise to stay forever. He offers his presence as long as there is reciprocity, and when that disappears, he leaves quietly. This silent exit is more powerful than any emotional argument, because now the relationship has to survive on its own, not because the man is forcing it to continue. And many relationships can't do that. The comfort of being desired without effort disappears. The guaranteed attention is gone. Now the other person must choose, invest or lose. No games, no excuses, no confusion. Machiavelli never taught people to destroy useful alliances. He taught people not to submit to alliances that weaken them. So the man who understands this does not reject connection, he rejects imbalance. He does not fear being alone because he knows that loneliness is better than losing himself piece by piece. And this changes everything, because someone who doesn't fear being alone doesn't accept just anything. That is why people say this kind of man should not multiply too much, because he breaks systems that rely on emotional dependence. He forces real choices, he requires real presence, and that is scary because it demands maturity, responsibility, and clear intention. There is no space left for comfortable confusion. Once you reach this awareness, there is no going back to innocence. You start seeing patterns where before you saw only exceptions. You realize that insistence is not proof of love, it is attachment. That reciprocity is not asked for, but it is observed. And that someone who truly wants to stay does not constantly create obstacles. Eventually, the dynamic reveals itself for what it truly is. Not just emotion, but a quiet struggle for position. Not to win over someone, but to avoid being swallowed by their expectations. Machiavelli understood that every human relationship involves power and intention, even when it is covered in affection. Ignoring this doesn't make you purer, it only makes you more vulnerable. A man who understands this moves with less noise and more intention. The common mistake is thinking that strategy kills emotion. It doesn't. It only prevents your emotions from being used against you. Someone who loves without any boundaries hands their life over to chance. Someone who loves with awareness chooses where to invest energy. A wise ruler does not spend resources where there is no return. And a conscious man does not give time, attention, and presence where there is no consistent reciprocity. This logic makes people uncomfortable because it shows the real cost of emotional choices. There is also a common trap, believing that being understanding will fix inconsistency. It doesn't. It only makes it last longer. When someone gives mixed signals, keeps delaying, and makes vague promises, the man who is still unaware tries to understand, gives space, tries to be patient. The man who has learned simply observes and adjusts his behavior. He reduces his effort to match what he receives, not as punishment, but for balance. Machiavelli would call this a balance of power. This quiet adjustment is powerful because it doesn't create open conflict. It simply reveals the truth without a fight. When the other person notices the change, less availability, less effort, less urgency, different reactions appear. Some people invest more, showing real interest. Some people complain, showing loss of control. Some disappear, showing they were there only for convenience. In every case, clarity increases, and clarity is power. What most people don't want to admit is this: many connections only survive because one side accepts more than they should. When that side stops, the structure collapses, not because of coldness, but because there was never a solid base. Machiavelli taught that weak alliances fall apart when tested. The same happens here. Strategic distance doesn't create the problem, it only reveals it. There is also a myth that emotional intensity means depth. Intensity is easy, depth requires consistency. A man who understands this is not impressed by emotional highs. He watches for continuity. He doesn't confuse jealousy with interest, drama with connection, or loneliness with desire. By not reacting to these signals, he removes the fuel from emotional games that need quick reactions. Machiavelli warned that provoking reactions is a way to control someone. The one who reacts loses position. The one who stays grounded gains it. This doesn't mean ignoring feelings, it means choosing when to act. A man who controls timing controls the story. He doesn't reply in the heat of the moment. He doesn't make decisions under emotional pressure. He waits long enough for intentions to reveal themselves. When a man starts living like this, something interesting happens. He becomes the reference point. Not because he demands it, but because he doesn't beg. People start choosing their words more carefully, their actions, their promises, because they realize access to him is not automatic. and access is valuable when it is not given to everyone. Value comes not from what you offer, but from the fact that you choose to offer it. This also changes how he sees rejection. He doesn't take it personally. He sees it as information. Rejection becomes data about compatibility, timing, and real interest. Machiavelli viewed losses as strategic information, not personal attacks. A man who thinks like this is not broken by a no. He simply adjusts direction. There is a difference between being distant and being selective. The distant man closes himself out of fear. The selective man opens himself by choice. The first creates confusion, the second creates clarity. A selective man doesn't pretend to be difficult. He is simply consistent. He shows up when there is alignment and leaves when there isn't, without drama, speeches, or trying to convince anyone. This is scary to some people because it removes the safe space of ambiguity. It forces them to choose, and choices reveal intentions. And not everyone wants their intentions revealed. Many prefer the in-between space where they can receive attention without commitment. A man who understands this does not stay in that in-between space. He knows that the limbo only benefits the person who avoids choosing. Machiavelli said a ruler should be loved and respected, but if he can't be both, it is better to be respected. In relationships, being feared doesn't mean physical fear. It means respect for consequences. And the consequences here are simple. Access is not guaranteed. Presence is not forever. Attention is not unlimited. People who understand this act more carefully. Those who don't lose their place. After this point, the man stops over-explaining his choices. He doesn't argue endlessly to prove he is right. He decides and stands by his decision. Because he knows that the one who tries too hard to convince has already lost authority. Calm firmness says more than any speech. And that's why this mindset is not popular. It requires emotional responsibility. It requires giving up comfortable games. It means accepting that not every connection deserves to continue. But once a man crosses this stage, he never accepts less than clear reciprocity again. He never confuses one-sided effort with love. He never loses himself trying to hold on to something that only exists while he makes himself smaller. There is a key moment when the difference between being controlled and being the one who chooses becomes final. It's not when someone leaves. It's not when someone returns. It's when the man realizes that his inner peace is worth more than any external validation. Machiavelli understood that real power begins when need ends. The one who needs less decides more. And the one who decides more guides the direction of the relationship without saying a word. At this point, the man no longer confuses connection with attachment. Attachment is fear disguised as affection. Connection is a conscious choice. Attachment asks for guarantees. Connection offers presence while there is alignment. This changes how he reacts to vague promises, unclear plans, and weak communication. He doesn't hold on to what might be. He looks at what is real, and what is real is supported by consistent actions, not nice words. Many men believe they must maintain the other person's interest. That belief is the beginning of emotional submission. If you think you must maintain it, you already believe it can slip away at any moment. Machiavelli taught that authority is not maintained by constant effort, but by strong structure. In relationships, strong structure means a stable identity, knowing who you are, what you accept, and what you will never negotiate. When that is clear, the interest that remains doesn't need to be forced. It stays because of real compatibility. A man who reaches this level is not afraid of silence. He reads it. He doesn't fill the gap with anxiety. He doesn't respond to absence with excess. He understands that every person reveals their true value by how they handle the access they are given. People who value you take care of you. People who don't value you test your limits. And those who test limits eventually meet limits. Not as punishment, but as a natural consequence. There is a quiet fear that this kind of man may become common because he is not controlled by emotional pressure. He doesn't feel guilty for protecting his own stability. He refuses to live in a situation where he must prove he deserves basic attention. He knows that reciprocity is not begged for, it is observed, and when it doesn't exist, he walks away without blaming anyone. Machiavelli said that men forget the death of a father faster than the loss of their wealth. In relationships, Wealth is access, attention, presence, availability. When access is no longer guaranteed, perception changes. Not because someone is cruel, but because the relationship is no longer one-sided. The person who was once comfortable now feels discomfort, and that discomfort reveals intentions that were previously hidden by habit. A man who understands this doesn't rush to restore someone else's comfort at the cost of his own. He allows the other person to feel his absence, not as punishment, but as reality. Because only in absence can you see the difference between value and routine. Constant presence creates emotional numbness. Chosen presence creates meaning. And meaning is what keeps a real relationship alive. At this stage, the man no longer defines himself by whether a relationship succeeds or fails. He understands that relationships are reflections, not foundations. His foundation is internal: values, boundaries, direction. Machiavelli taught that a ruler must build inner strength before expanding outward. The same applies here. If you don't govern yourself emotionally, you will be governed by others' emotions. What many people call coldness is actually consistency. A consistent man does not change himself just to please others. He doesn't trade his principles to avoid temporary discomfort. He doesn't promise what he cannot support. This consistency is rare, and because it is rare, people notice it, even if he is silent. There is also a false belief that showing vulnerability always creates closeness. Machiavelli would warn that vulnerability shared without care can become a tool of control. A man who understands this doesn't shut down, but he chooses who he opens up to. He doesn't confuse intimacy with uncontrolled exposure. He knows that trust is built, not rushed, and people who demand full access too quickly often don't want connection, they want control. This man doesn't want others to fear him, he wants real respect. Respect comes from clear boundaries, from knowing which lines will not be crossed, which behaviors will not be repeated, and which actions have consequences, not out of revenge, but out of coherence. And coherence creates safety, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. When someone realizes that they can no longer rely on your automatic attention, something shifts. Some people step away because they cannot handle this new dynamic. Some people move away. Others come closer and change their behavior. Both results are victories, because both bring clarity. Machiavelli preferred clear enemies over doubtful allies. In the same way, a wise man prefers honest absence over confusing presence. This is the point where the silent wish grows stronger, the hope that you never reach this level, because once you do, you can no longer be controlled by guilt, fear, or urgency. You don't react to the first emotional push, you don't fall apart because of uncertainty, you don't trade your dignity for emotional crumbs. You choose, and someone who chooses cannot be easily controlled. The real change doesn't come from what you do outwardly, but from what you stop doing inside yourself. It's when a man stops negotiating with himself, stops excusing other people's contradictions just to avoid the discomfort of loss, stops rewriting the story just to keep alive something that already died in reality. Machiavelli understood that the worst corruption comes from inside, from the small compromises we make in the name of convenience. When someone corrupts themselves internally, they become weak externally. At this point, the man realizes something important. It's not the other person's absence that hurts. It's the expectations he built without a real foundation. When the expectation dies, the pain fades. When the illusion falls, peace rises. He understands that many connections were sustained more by hope than by reality. And hope, without consistent action, is just a delay of the truth. From here on, he no longer looks for signs. He looks for patterns. He doesn't judge isolated messages, he watches behavior over time. He doesn't cling to rare good moments that never repeat. He doesn't use exceptions to deny the rule. Machiavelli said that leadership is about reading trends, not single events. The same applies to relationships. One nice gesture does not erase a pattern of neglect. One promise does not cancel repeated absence. A man who reaches this awareness is not threatened by other options. He doesn't try to remove invisible competition. He knows that anyone who must compete for attention has already lost stability inside. He does not demand exclusivity before reciprocity. He does not offer commitment before consistency. He lets the other person reveal themselves through their behavior over time. And time, when watched calmly, always tells the truth. Machiavelli said people are changeable, self-interested, and often ungrateful, not as an insult, but as a description of human nature. A man who accepts this does not become bitter. He becomes prepared. He doesn't expect people to be different from human nature. He only expects alignment between words and actions. And when that doesn't exist, he doesn't try to fix it. He simply steps back. There comes a point where distance stops being a tactic and becomes a natural consequence. No anger, no revenge, no long explanations, just a clear realization that it no longer holds together. A man who reaches this level doesn't need to announce his exit. He simply reduces his presence until his absence becomes permanent. Machiavelli would call this a tactical withdrawal. He leaves without creating enemies, without noise, without wasting energy. This kind of exit is powerful because it gives no material for emotional manipulation. There is no drama to exploit, no guilt to trigger, no fight to win, only silence and consistency. And this, paradoxically, has more impact than confrontation, because it forces the other person to face themselves without using your reaction as a mirror. A man who lives like this does not feel responsible for managing emotions that are not his. He doesn't rush to calm anxiety he didn't cause. He doesn't accept vague guilt just to keep access. He understands that emotional maturity means dealing with frustration without blaming others. And those who can't do that reveal more about themselves than about him. At this stage, the man stops romanticizing one-sided sacrifice. He understands that sacrifice only makes sense when both people are building together. Otherwise, it is just self-abandonment disguised as virtue. Machiavelli never praised naive sacrifice. He praised effectiveness. And here, effectiveness means protecting your emotional integrity while still allowing real connection. What truly scares people is that this man becomes immune to emotional triggers. Jealousy as a weapon doesn't work. Calculated distance doesn't create panic. Ambiguity doesn't create attachment, because he doesn't build his identity on someone else's reaction. He only responds to what is real. And when reality is weak, it doesn't deserve investment. There is some loneliness on this path, not the loneliness of being alone, but of no longer joining in collective emotional games. Many relationships end when you stop playing the expected role, but the aware man accepts this temporary loneliness. Aware, because it is the price of inner freedom. Machiavelli would say that real power always demands a price before offering stability. This man begins to attract not through neediness, but through presence. Not by chasing, but by choosing. He doesn't sell himself as an emotional solution. He simply stands as a conscious presence, and that filters people. It pushes away those who seek control and attracts those who seek partnership. And even if no one stays, he still keeps what matters most, his dignity. This is where the silent fear becomes clear. A man like this cannot be controlled by ready-made narratives. He doesn't buy empty speeches. He doesn't reshape himself to fit others' expectations. He lives in alignment with himself, and a person who lives like that forces the world around them to readjust, not by force, but as a natural consequence. Once you reach this point, there is no return to the old state. You may miss the innocence, but you can no longer ignore what is obvious. You can't pretend not to see, and when you see, you choose. Those who choose don't beg, and those who don't beg cannot be easily controlled. The final outcome of all this is not conquest, not winning someone back, not validation. It is independence. And independence is the most feared thing in any system where someone is used to leading without being questioned. Machiavelli always said that the greatest threat to any power structure is not open rebellion, but the silent withdrawal of those who stop believing. When a man stops believing in the narratives that kept him predictable, the whole system must change. At this final stage, the man no longer seeks results in relationships. He seeks alignment. He doesn't measure success by how long someone stays, but by how light, reciprocal, and clear the connection feels. He no longer tries to win invisible games, because he has realized that the real prize was always leaving them whole. Machiavelli would say that true victory is protecting your own territory without needing to expand it by force. And here something becomes clear. Many relationships were never about deep affection. They were about emotional convenience, having someone available, predictable, and always willing to give in. When that automatic availability disappears, the mask falls. Some people try to regain control with words, late promises, sudden intensity. Others quietly disappear because they don't know how to stay without an advantage. Both reactions confirm what the aware man already knows. If someone only changes their behavior after they lose control, it was never about you. It was about access. Machiavelli said people change their behavior when the cost changes. The man who reaches this level does not fall for reactive changes. He watches whether the behavior stays the same once the risk of loss disappears. He is not impressed by emotional intensity after long periods of neglect. He understands. Someone who shows up only when they fear losing you does not value presence. They value possession. And he no longer allows himself to be anyone's possession. This man also stops fearing labels like cold, distant, selfish, difficult. He knows labels are tools used by people who lost influence, an attempt to control what no longer reacts to old triggers. Machiavelli never tried to be loved by everyone. He tried to be effective. And here, effectiveness means living without betraying yourself just to fit others' expectations. What remains in the end is an uncomfortable clarity. Most people don't want a conscious man. They want a useful man, someone emotionally available on demand, someone who carries insecurities that are not his. When you stop playing that role, you stop being useful to certain relationships. And that is freeing. Because usefulness is not love, convenience is not connection, habit is not desire. A man who walks this path realizes he does not need to be desired by everyone. He only needs to respect himself. And that inner respect changes everything. His posture, his presence, even his silence. He doesn't need to prove anything. He doesn't need to convince anyone that he is worth it. Those who recognize his value move closer. Those who don't move away. Both outcomes are fine. Machiavelli said, "A wise ruler prepares for the worst while enjoying the best." A conscious man does the same. He allows himself to feel, to connect, to care, but never at the cost of his integrity. He doesn't build his emotional life on fragile promises. He builds it on repeated actions. And this removes much of the suffering that comes from unrealistic expectations. The silent fear behind all of this is not the fear that you will become arrogant. It is the fear that you will become uncontrollable, not in an aggressive way, but in a deep, inner way. Uncontrollable. Not because you are aggressive, but because you don't react the way others expect, because you don't accept less than consistency, because you don't stay out of fear of being alone, because you know how to leave without hate and how to stay without losing yourself. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing things you used to ignore. You feel when something is not aligned, even if the words sound beautiful. You step away before the situation becomes humiliating. You choose your peace, even when your ego wants validation. And this changes how you move in the world, not only in relationships. Machiavelli never promised comfort. He promised clarity. And clarity has a price, the price of no longer joining collective illusions, the price of losing easy access to people, the price of being less understood. But in return, it offers something rare. Inner sovereignty, the ability not to be dragged into dynamics that shrink who you are. That is why people hope you never discover this kind of message, because it doesn't make you cruel. It makes you whole. And someone who is whole cannot be controlled by guilt, urgency, or fear. He chooses, and someone who chooses is not for sale. This is where the cycle ends, not with an external victory, but with the restoration of your inner control. The only control that truly matters. Because when you govern yourself, everything else becomes a choice, not a necessity.